Afternoon VHR, Hans and Franz's encounter breakdown with tanks, heals, and DPS responsibility. We're going to start with tanks. When both bosses are active, tanks need to make sure that we tank them together so that way we can enable cleave damage. We have to make sure also that we're paying attention for when crippling suplex occurs. That way the tank that's being hit with CS is using a DRCD properly. Finally, in the 15%, when both bosses are active, we need to make sure that we're cycling our cooldowns to mitigate the boss's melee attack, since both will be present at that point. When only one boss is active, though, we got to make sure that we're doing a proper swap after body slam. And then also during the time periods when we have the conveyor belts active, we need to avoid both of the SP functions. That's the searing plates and the stampeding presses. Healer responsibilities include cooldowns on tanks during CS, and then watch for DR because raid-wide damage does occur through these mechanics. Also, they'll have to be watching out for direct heals, but really a majority of the individuals in DPS need to make sure they're doing the best they can to be responsible to not get hit by any of the functions during the conveyor belt aspects, which is off and on throughout the fight and then active consistently from 15% to 0. So just make sure that you have your personals available and things of that nature. For DPS, make sure that when we have the two bosses active, we're using cleave damage to do as much damage to both of them as we can. And then also when there's only one boss, then we go into a single target rotation. And we'll just adjust as far as how much damage we can put into the bosses during the times that the conveyor belts are active. Remember that any time that if you do end up getting hit by either one of the SP functions while the conveyor belts are active, that you use a personal if necessary or a damage reduction. Remember also that during body slams, the tanks are going to be one of the first ones to be focused by it when the individual does it, which is about like every 25 seconds, I believe. So at that point, when you see the red arrow above the tanks or DBM calls out that BS is coming through, you need to make sure that you're paying heads-up attention, not tunneling, and moving away from the individual at least 12 yards that's got the arrow above their head. And that's going to apply to like both of the tanks and all melee and range throughout the entire fight. Another note to also put out for everybody is that you need to watch out for the edges during the conveyor belts when both the SP attacks are available, because the damage is going to be universal as far as what the SPs do if you get hit by them. And then the edges, just because they look like they're not on fire, they can still do scorching damage to you. So we're just going to have to learn that, as far as the distance of what's comfortable and what's not. It also highlights not to stand, for example, between different searing presses when they're present. Or stamping presses when they're present. So just make sure that you're paying attention for these effects. And then, if necessary, for example, like I said, we're going to use Hero at the beginning, but if we end up doing pretty well, but we start getting stuck on one of the transitions, for example, like at 15%, with both the bosses up and everything going crazy, we might save it for that later in the fight. For example, if we're having issues with that part of it. But I think this is going to be something that's scalable, and we just have to learn, how the movement affects us and how we're going to be able to adjust to it as we need to. Remember also that in our format for structure, that we're going to have the bosses present like so in the middle of the stage, and then it'll either be both of them or one, for example. And then we're going to have the tanks on them. So what we'll do is we'll have one tank here. And then what we can do is we're going to split melee and also the range to the outsides of each side. So we'll do one group that's melee range on one side. And then we'll do another group that will be marked with blue. That's melee range on the other side. And then any given time that you see the body slam, you can go to any of the directions that you need to. So you'll have, plenty of escape routes that you can travel to be able to minimize the amount of time, or minimize the amount of damage, the 12-yard damage that's going on. So just pay attention for when the arrows come up and when DBM shouts it, so that way we can make sure we're doing the best we can to avoid as much damage as possible, because it's pretty much a lot of single target spike with multi-target damage that's possible, and then AoE effects that go on too when certain mechanics are done, during like the DR, for example. If you have any questions or comments, please post below. If you enjoyed the video, please click like, continue to follow us, and don't forget that we're on Twitch. Sign-Up35 will be broadcasting tonight, doing the normal content using these strategies. Appreciate any kind of likes that we can get out of that, and any kind of subscriptions, etc. Okay? Thank you. Have a blessed day.